The U.S. evacuated another 19,000 people out of Afghanistan between Tuesday and Wednesday. Up to 1,500 Americans still remain in the country.
Since the U.S. and coalition forces began the evacuation, to date, approximately 88,000 have safely departed from Afghanistan. Every 39 minutes yesterday, a plane departed Kabul airport. These numbers are a testament to the hardworking and brave service members carrying out this mission.
Defense officials say that number includes over 4,000 Americans. The Biden administration is racing against the clock to complete the evacuation of all U.S. citizens and Afghan allies by the end of the month. A day after President Biden said the government was on track to meet this deadline, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the efforts would continue as long as necessary.
Let me be crystal clear about this. There is no deadline on our work to help any remaining American citizens who decide they want to leave to do so, along with the many Afghans who have stood by us over these many years and want to leave and have been unable to do so. That effort will continue every day past August 31st. The Taliban have made public and private commitments to provide and permit safe passage for Americans, for third country nationals, and Afghans at risk going forward past August 31st.
Meanwhile, Congress is heading into a busy September. Last night, the House voted along party lines to advance two key parts of President Biden's economic agenda. Lawmakers passed the framework for a $3.5 trillion budget plan. They also picked September 27th as the date to vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Enhanced federal unemployment benefits are set to expire September 6th. By September 30th, lawmakers need to decide whether to reauthorize the federal highway program, temporary assistance for needy families, and increased funding for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. The biggest concern is government funding, which also runs out that day, and a battle over raising the debt ceiling still looms. For more, let's bring in Kris Van Cleave, Natalie Jennings, and Sarah Westwood. Kris is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Natalie is deputy Washington editor for The Washington Post. And Sarah is a political and investigative reporter for The Washington Examiner. Welcome. It's good to have you all. Sarah, let me start with you. You have been fact-checking the Biden administration's messaging on Afghanistan. And you wrote that, quote, lawmakers outraged by the apparent lack of planning behind the drawdown have been angered even further by scrambled signals from the White House. What are some of the discrepancies you found?
Well, I think, as that quote demonstrates, there would have been outrage from Republicans regardless of what the Biden administration was saying. So I think the messaging part of this narrative is really different from criticism of the tactical aspects of the drawdown. But certainly the Biden administration has not helped itself by being sort of all over the map on some of these messages. And one of the biggest areas in which they've been inconsistent is what the intelligence suggested before the fall of Kabul earlier this month. Last week, President Biden had this interview with ABC News, and he suggested that the chaos that we're seeing in Kabul as a result of the Taliban taking over was inevitable, and that is what the administration expected all along. Then you have people like General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other military leaders who are saying there was nothing in any intelligence briefings that suggested that the Afghan government would collapse in a matter of 11 days. So there's not really a consistent answer to the question of what the Biden administration knew as it proceeded forward with these plans to withdraw troops from Afghanistan on this timeline. The administration has also been really inconsistent about the number of Americans who are in Afghanistan, whether or not they're stranded. The White House press secretary sort of took some heat in conservative media about her denying that any Americans are stranded when there are a number of reports to the contrary. That answer isn't really clear from the Biden administration right now. There are hundreds, perhaps even more than 1,000, according to the State Department today, Americans who are still in Afghanistan. Some of them may be in parts of the country that are controlled by the Taliban, far away from Kabul, and therefore may be having a more difficult time getting to the one access point for evacuations in Kabul. And the Biden administration is not really sufficiently answering questions about what happens to those Americans and those very at-risk Afghan allies who remain behind after August 31st. And in fact, the White House couldn't even answer yesterday the question about what precisely an August 31st deadline means, whether that means midnight on the 30th, whether that means running through the clock on the day of the 31st. There hasn't been a lot of clarity from the Biden administration about all of this and about how it went from something they were so confident about going smoothly in June and July. Biden administration officials, including the president himself, was really downplaying the possibility at all that we could see chaos to this and still not having a clear answer. That, I think, is what is driving a lot of the bipartisan criticism. And it's brought a lot of Democrats on board with criticizing the Biden administration as well, whereas if Biden and others had adequately prepared the public to witness these kinds of images, maybe that criticism would have just been confined to the right.
And against that backdrop, Kris, we learned that Congressman Seth Moulton and Peter Meijer secretly traveled to Afghanistan to, in their words, oversee the evacuations. Now, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi criticized the move earlier. Let's listen to that.
We didn't want anybody to think this was a good idea and that they should try to follow suit. Again, I've been busy. It's an important thing. We wanted to make sure they were safe for themselves, but also for what consequences could flow, a ramification if something happened to them while they were there. So they have to make their own case as to why they went and this or that. But it was not, in my view, a good idea.
So, Kris, tell us a bit more about these congressmen and why did they say they went?
Well, this was a rare moment where Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy were sort of in agreement, both saying that they do not think members of Congress should go to Afghanistan right now. Mr. McCarthy added, but he understands their frustration. Most members of Congress today were critical, or at least skeptical, of these two lawmakers going to Afghanistan. Both are Iraq War veterans. And look, they wanted to get a sense for what was the reality on the ground there. Congress does have oversight authority of the military, of the State Department, and as part of the checks and balances system, even to some extent the executive branch. So they can make an argument that in order to do that oversight job, they have to know what's happening on the ground, so they went. Both lawmakers have stressed that they took flights that were where there was available seating. They flew commercially, we understand, up into the Middle East, and then took a military plane that was empty into Afghanistan. They came back on a flight that had empty seats. They sat in cruise seats, so they argued they didn't take a seat away from somebody who was trying to get out of the country. The military has said that they would prefer lawmakers not to be there right now, is that it does distract from the focus because you've got to make sure that the lawmakers are protected. But in this case, you have a Republican and a Democrat, both of whom believe the August 31st deadline is not one we should be sticking to. And here you also have veterans who wanted to see what was happening with their own eyes, so they got on planes and they went. They did it with managed to maintain secrecy, and so people were quite surprised when they learned about it. We know that Kevin McCarthy told us today that he hasn't spoken with Representative Meijer since his return, but knew that Meijer had been working to try to get people out of the country, as many members of Congress have been working to try to expedite folks out of Afghanistan prior to his departure.
All right. Certainly the news did come as a surprise. Sarah, what are we learning about the number of Afghan refugees arriving in the U.S. and the resources that will be available to them?
That number still remains a little unclear because there are Afghan refugees who are in other places such as Doha and Qatar, where they are still being processed. But those who have made it far enough along in this, what is traditionally a 14-step process, are being brought to the U.S. and they are going to have access to a number of benefits through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and those include cash assistance, medical assistance, job preparation, and things like that. And some who are brought over may also qualify for non-refugee specific benefits like food stamps and other benefit programs like that. But I think it'll be absolutely fascinating to watch what Republicans do after the dust of this initial evacuation effort has settled, when there are going to to be potentially many refugees coming to the U.S. as their applications are processed through this expedited system that Congress approved earlier this year, that the Biden administration is trying to execute for these Afghans who are trying to get Afghans out to escape the Taliban. Because Republicans typically have aligned themselves with a more anti-immigrant platform, but they also have more hawkish national security views. And there's a real national security implication for taking care of the Afghans who have supported the U.S. military, and the signal that that sends to people in other countries where the U.S. military is still active about what they can expect if they do put their lives on the line to help American forces there. But the idea of bringing refugees in large numbers over to the U.S. is typically something that Republicans reflexively oppose. And you are already seeing signs on the right that this may be an idea that doesn't go over well with conservatives, that doesn't go over well with some of the further right lawmakers on Capitol Hill. So it will be absolutely fascinating to see, once the dust has settled, whether those Republicans do continue to advocate for bringing over large numbers of Afghan refugees who are awaiting the processing of their special immigrant visas, or whether there's going to be some sort of rift on the right about bringing them over, and whether they will start to insist that Afghan refugees are resettled in other countries. It's not clear how they're going to handle that, because they're sort of unified right now in their criticism of the Biden administration and of the fact that this expedited evacuation of Afghans didn't start until 2 weeks before the fall of Kabul. And there's plenty of blame to go around about why that didn't happen. But nonetheless, those flights didn't start taking off until the end of July. But once we're over the hump of focusing on how the Biden administration potentially mishandled this, Republicans may oppose bringing these Afghans over because of the way that they typically approach these sorts of refugee and immigrant issues. And that will be a really interesting one to watch, because you may see some hawkish Republicans break with the party and insist that these people be allowed into the country because of the national security aspect of this equation.
That is going to be really interesting to watch, because those fault lines, as you point out, Sarah, are very complicated when you talk about global sort of geopolitical implications here. All right, switching gears, Natalie, President Biden held a cybersecurity summit this afternoon. Who was invited, and what does the White House say it's doing to raise the bar on cybersecurity?
That's right, Elaine. It was sort of a who's who of tech and financial CEOs. You had major bank CEOs, the JP Morgan Chase and so on, Amazon CEO, Alphabet, IBM, a really big roster of big influential people. And he put the onus on them. What President Biden told them was that the U.S. government is not going to be able to fully weigh in here to stop the threat of cyber attacks like the one we saw against T-Mobile earlier this month, the one we saw in the Colonial Pipeline earlier this year. He is putting the onus on these companies to do more to bake into their products things that will prevent cyber attacks from or make it easier, I guess I should say, for users to prevent cyber attacks, and also just to build in more infrastructure. And also, he brought in some people with educational backgrounds, people who want to encourage more cybersecurity skills. There's about 500,000 job openings now for cybersecurity professionals in the United States. And when you think about that number of those type of jobs being unfilled, it's not hard to imagine what the consequences are of that.
Yeah, it's such a critically important issue, as we've seen from recent incidents. Kris, on another topic, Tuesday, the House passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It seeks to strengthen a key provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act after it was gutted by the Supreme Court. Tell us more about how that provision would impact voters and the bill's future.
Well, the John Lewis bill aims to restore a lot of the things that the Supreme Court has taken out of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and that includes a language that would require pre-clearing certain kinds of changes to voting laws with the Department of Justice before a state could implement them. It also allows the Attorney General to request federal observers at some state elections. It increases transparency by adding some additional requirements. There's also a targeted process that the Justice Department would have to review changes to election law. Republicans have called this a federal takeover of state and local elections, very similar talking point to what they've said about S1, H1, the other voting rights bill that's stalled in the Senate but has passed the House. This passed on a straight party line vote. There were no Republicans supporting it in the House. It has a very tough road in the Senate as well. It seems unlikely it would get 60 votes, at least at this point, but it should have the backing at least of the 50 Democrats in the Senate. The other challenge when we're talking about something in the Senate is you laid out at the beginning of this segment just how busy the next few weeks of congressional time will be in the end of September when everybody's back here. There are a lot of other things that have to get handled, and it seems unlikely just that there's going to be room or oxygen for this bill in the near future, given all of the things that have to pass, and the debt ceiling has to be addressed. The government has to be funded. The infrastructure bill in the House, which means the budget bill, has to be done in the Senate. There's just a lot competing for attention right now, and this seems to have a very uphill battle.
Yeah, and yet we know that activists have no plans to let up their political pressure on the White House to do more. Finally, Natalie, President Biden meets with Israel's new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, on Thursday. What should we be looking for out of that meeting?
That's right. This is the new Israeli Prime Minister's first foreign trip. He's coming here at a time when tensions with Israel and Iran, which are always there, are mounting. He wants to sort of impress a message that the U.S. should not pursue another nuclear deal with Iran, and we'll see how President Biden wants to react to that. We know he has some interest in at least reopening the talks with Iran, so that will be the major highlight to look through out of there. But the other thing is, and the Israeli Prime Minister said yesterday, this is a bit of a reset. Tensions between U.S. leaders and the leadership of Israel have been pretty high for these two allies in the last couple of years. Now there's new leadership after more than a decade of Benjamin Netanyahu's administration. This is a new change. And so we'll just see what sort of new dynamic develops. And this is our first chance to look at that.
All right, yet another busy news week. Kris Van Cleave, Natalie Jennings, and Sarah Westwood, thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.